My name is Jenna Sacedo Herrera, and I'm the president and CEO of Greater SATX. We are the regional economic development organization here in San Antonio. And I also have the privilege of serving on the Texas Biomedical Research Institute's Board of Trustees. Welcome back to Texas Biomed's third annual Global Health Symposium, broadcasting live from the San Antonio Botanical Garden. And for those of you tuning in for the first time, welcome and thank you for joining us today. At Greater SATX, we have a mission of developing and diversifying the San Antonio economy. And we do that by investing in our people and our place to secure quality job investments. To achieve that mission, we realize that economic prosperity is connected to a larger community ecosystem that relies on high-quality education, healthcare, and opportunity for all. Said simply, industry and community go hand in hand. Healthcare and bioscience is the leading industry in San Antonio, creating more than a $42 billion economic impact and employing more than 187,000 residents. In fact, 1 in 6 people in San Antonio are employed in this industry sector, which is one of the reasons that San Antonio is a city of science. Home to military medicine, our residents understand both the complexity and hope that science brings to our community, which is why we are so extremely proud of Texas Biomed and its accomplishments over many years, but also in recent years under the leadership of Dr. Larry Schlesinger. We know, though, that science alone can't solve the challenges of health inequity across our communities. And while San Antonio has much opportunity by way of population growth and demographic diversity, we also have our fair share of challenges with socioeconomic disparities, healthcare access, mental health service delivery, and more. And so we are so glad that each of you have chosen to participate in this symposium to help share solutions and best practices for addressing some of these challenges. Each of us can take what we learn here and reshape these ideas to meet the needs of our own communities. Whether you're here in San Antonio or in England or Nigeria, all of our citizens deserve an opportunity to live longer, healthier lives. We look forward to learning more from each of you as we work toward building greater health equity across the globe. Thank you to all of our partners for your support, which makes this symposium possible. Before we head into our opening keynote speaker, we have a short video presentation. Thank you.
Texas Biomedical Research Institute is a private, nonprofit infectious disease research organization with the mission of protecting you, your families, and our global communities from the threats of infectious diseases. COVID-19 has taught us that these diseases can upend our lives like no other illness, but science has become the hero. Texas Biomed is proud of its role in powering a new approach to research that is accelerating the development of diagnostics, therapies, and vaccines for the world's deadliest infections. Texas Biomed is the only research institute in the U.S. dedicated to eradicating infection by combining the unique resources of the highest biocontainment laboratories with the National Primate Research Center and an innovative business model. Continuing the pioneering vision of its founder, Tom Slick Jr., that science transform human health, Texas Biomed couples independent basic science with a nimble contract research division to move science forward faster. Because health starts with science. Health starts at Texas Biomed.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you on behalf of Bank of America. I'm honored to be here today. Each of you have made a big difference in make big difference in closing the health equity gap, and that's important. That's why we're all here today. This morning, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Mr. David Wally, who will be presenting on supporting equity in biomedical research and development lessons from the pandemic. Mr. Wally is highly experienced healthcare nonprofit executive and a leader in the field of building and managing public-private partnerships that support life sciences. He is currently Executive Vice President of Strategy and Business Development at Foundation of National Institutes of Health, having led the foundation and as its interim president and executive director and official board member. Previously, David led the Research Partnership Division for FNIH for 15 years, during which he helped virtually establish the now flourishing field of biomedical research, private-public partnerships. He continues to be involved in leading several major collaborations he has helped establish, most notably the Accelerated COVID-19 Therapeutic Interventions and Vaccines. Other key partnerships David has been instrumental in founding include the Accelerating Medicines Partnership, the Partnership to Accelerate Cancer Therapeutics, the Biomakers Consortium, and the Lung MAP Masters Protocol Trial Platform in Cancer. Prior to his career at FNIH, David spent 15 years at IBM Corporation in a variety of sales, marketing, product development, and corporate strategy roles, and was a senior executive for 2 venture-funded healthcare information technology startup companies. Mr. Wally holds a master's in philosophy from Rutgers University and a certificate in business administration from Stern School of Business in New York University. Please help me welcome to the stage Mr. David Wally.
Thank you very much. Well, I don't need to introduce myself. Arturo did such a fantastic job. I want to talk to you today about health equity, and I know that this is the main focus of this meeting. But it is such a vast topic, as I hope you're beginning to appreciate. Equity touches every single part of the healthcare system, from basic research through delivery and beyond. And I can only hope to touch in a small piece of it. So I'm going to focus a bit, really mostly on research, although there's a piece of this that has to do with global health equity. And I am going to touch on both domestic health equity and a bit on global, because the FNIH has 2 significant programs in each of these areas. I'm not a health equity expert. As Ventura pointed out, I've really been focusing on building public-private partnerships in biomedical research for the last 17 years at FNIH. But I do find this definition, which is something that was developed as part of our pandemic treaty discussions with WHO, is really useful, because it is very broad, right? Because it basically says that the definition of equity is really anything that is a remediable difference, no matter whether you're talking about economic diversity, racial, ethnic, or other. That inequality is inequality, and then lack of inclusivity is lack of inclusivity. A little bit about the Foundation for the National Institutes of Health. We're based just outside of Washington, D.C., but given we're in a town that is not known for keeping its secrets, we seem to be a well-kept one. We're actually not the NIH. We are a nonprofit, completely separate, independent 501c3 with its own board. But we were founded by the U.S. Congress 27 years ago with the unique mission of supporting the FNIH's mission in public health. Now, the FNIH does many wonderful things. I think most people say they are the jewel of our government's healthcare system, but they are constrained by federal regulation in the way they do medical research. They cannot take funds from the private sector, pharmaceutical companies, others. They have rigid ways in which they can interact with them. And so the Congress got together and said we need a mechanism in the era of the Human Genome Project and the promise in science to do some of this more flexibly. And that's why they put us in place. we really have three major focuses here. One is a very pragmatic focus on bringing better prevention, diagnostics, and treatments to patients, on accelerating translational research by bringing together these institutions and the scientists from pharmaceutical companies, from patient organizations, from the academic sector, and from government, NIH and FDA and other agencies, with the idea that science done together is going to be more effective. We only work on problems where a problem that really cannot be solved as easily by one entity. It really needs a village to solve it. The second area is we have an entire part of the foundation that works in global health and equity. And this is a series of programs largely funded in collaboration with the Fogarty Institute and Center at NIH, but also very close collaboration with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And then finally, we have a number of programs that are designed to help train, equip, and celebrate the achievements of the next generation of scientists. I've raised about $1.5 billion, pretty much mostly over the last 15 years or so. We're only about 90 employees, and we spend 90 cents of every dollar on the actual research that we fund, so we're frighteningly efficient. But we have a wide range of programs here. Some of these are things that Ventura mentioned, and they range from things like the AMP partnership, which is designed to increase our understanding of tractable disease biology and create new opportunities for drug targets across a wide range of diseases, to, at the other end, our work in maternal and child health. Just back in January, a landmark finding from our A+ trial, which we worked on with the Child Health and Development Institute at the NIH and Bill and Melinda Gates, which basically proved that administering azithromycin in low and middle income countries and low resource settings to expectant mothers reduces sepsis and maternal death by over 30%. So this is a widely available drug. It's a huge finding. Today I'm going to talk mostly about active and then a little bit about this pandemic treaty piece that we talked about. So to set the stage, I need to take you back to 23rd of March in 2020. I think a lot of us had kind of started sheltering in our homes and not going to the office anymore. And we were at nearly 100,000 confirmed cases of COVID-19 in this country, over 1,700 deaths. But one of the great things was, as the engine of biomedical research had ginned up, and there were studies blossoming everywhere across the world, in the United States, to try and figure out this disease and how could we stop it. The problem is that very, very few of these were large enough, well-designed enough, sufficiently randomized with sufficient statistical power to produce something that was going to be actionable. And according to a study that Janet Woodcock and Kevin Bugan of FDA did later in the year, they looked at 2,500 of these studies and found that only 5% were going to be adequate for a result. This was exactly the problem that Francis Collins recognized and that he brought to me when he called me on a Saturday afternoon in late March. And I was used to talking to Francis about the NIH director about a lot of things, but Saturday afternoon calls were a little rare. And he said, we have this issue, we've got to do something about it, and NIH can't do it alone. This is going to require collaboration with the private sector. I think we need a public-private partnership to address it. And in 3 weeks, we had something set up. We were able to go to all of our contacts from our other organizations and put together a group of 20 companies, 8 government agencies, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and several other nonprofits, and put together a leadership group that, excuse me. We had a leadership team that was co-chaired by Francis and by Paul Stoffels. who was our, Paul Stoffels, who's on our board and is the Chief Scientific Officer of Janssen & Janssen. And then we established this leadership team, and the heads of all the companies were involved, and they were on the phone every week. These are people running these vast pharmaceutical R&D operations to try to figure out what to do. We also set up 4 working groups, and these are the 4 main aims of ACTIV. And this involved over 125 scientists from across academia, pharmaceutical industry, NIH, BARDA, FDA, all working on common themes. Now, thanks to over 40 years of investment by the NIH and by institutions like this and other academic institutions, we actually were fortunate enough, as you know, to have already in development some vaccines that proved to be pretty effective. But there were many questions that were not able to be answered at that time, such as, what should the criteria be for early use authorization? And how were you going to run the vaccine trials? Was everyone going to run their own design? We're going to have one master design, which turned out we just didn't have the time to do that, or what we ended up doing, which was a harmonized design. So one committee really advised on that. They did not run the vaccine trials. The NIAID at NIH did that, but we had a big role in advising them and FDA. One group, and I was talking to Larry about this earlier, was really responsible for marshaling the resources for preclinical research. So at this time, there was a real emergency in terms of being able to find enough non-human primates in which to test the COVID-19 treatments, specifically African green monkeys and rhesus macaques. And this was because everyone was trying to, grab them to use in their research, but also, if you remember, there were a lot of cross-border restrictions, and so the animals could not travel to the laboratories where they were. So we set up a national master protocol. ACTIV set up this master protocol. We figured out, we created inventories of preclinical resources, and together with the pharmaceutical companies, figured out an SOP for how you accelerate preclinical research. Where can you cut corners? Where should you never cut corners when you're in pandemic mode? The next, and I think the central pillar of ACTIV, and one of its great successes, was developing therapeutics. Unlike vaccines, we had nothing in the realm of therapeutics. There were not even really very many good antiviral candidates that had sufficient safety and efficacy to go into any kind of testing. But we did know there were a lot of drugs out there that might be able to help. And what we ended up creating was the largest drug repurposing effort in human history. And now to do that, you need clinical sites. And you would think, well, go to NIH, they know where all these sites are. Nope. We had no idea there was no one inventory of all the sites, much less knowledge about where they were in terms of their readiness to deal with COVID-19 and what were their needs. And this group put together a comprehensive survey of over 700 of these sites worldwide, with complete information, all this, and then created a geo-tracking tool, because if you remember, the virus was moving around all over the place and popping up here and there. So you could kind of skate to where the puck was going to be in terms of where you were going to deploy a trial. And that tool still exists at NIH. And then finally, I think the clinical therapeutics group, which did the most amazing job of sorting through which of the hundreds of potential treatments would be most likely to succeed in clinical trials, at selecting those, and then building a set of robust trial infrastructures in which to test them. So this group, a group of folks that did, I guess, some of you are familiar, with the peer review and study section methodology at NIH. There was no time for that. This group rapidly but robustly sorted through over 800 potential agents and ended up choosing 37 to put into trials. Now, you needed to have trials also that addressed all of the stages of COVID. So, from mild infection outpatient to moderate hospitalized patients, severe hospitalization, those on ventilators and so forth, and then what happens in convalescent space. So you needed a variety of trials that would test different medications, and as you saw, there were not just preventive medications, but medications that would also, like immune modulators, that would treat the symptoms, and to do this in a very rapid fashion. Active, now a master protocol is where you can test multiple drugs in one designed setting. And you have different arms, but they follow a common protocol. FDA only has to approve that protocol once, essentially, go through the formal approval process. It's a very rapid way of doing this once it's set up. But because it involves multiple companies, it takes a long time to set these up, usually 12 to 18 months. Well, we set up 10 of them and had them up and running in 14 months. So really quite a success. Over the last 2 years or so, as I said, 800 agents that were reviewed and sorted through, 37 chosen. We've completed testing completely on 33 of these. There's a few more of the trials that are running out. And we found only 6 successes. And some of these successes, including some of the monoclonal antibodies, we were, of course, later on when Omicron and other variants showed up, those had to be withdrawn because they weren't successful against the variants. But, and some of this is just the, fact that 95% of drug trials fail, what Janet Woodcock was fond of calling the heartbreak of drug development. But, the other very important piece of this is, finding out what did not work, because in an atmosphere of mistrust of science and misinformation, it was really important to show, for example, conclusively with a large randomized trial that, folks, nope, ivermectin does not help protect you against COVID-19. Okay, so that was active. What about equity? Well, I think everyone realized fairly early on, and these are just some of the statistics, that the burden of the COVID-19 pandemic was not following equally across the American population. The burden was falling, of course, on those who were economically disadvantaged, but very specifically on Black and Hispanic communities, as is represented by this graph. NIH was extremely sensitive to this issue. On July 4th, Francis pulled together all of the NIH leaders and said, we need a plan to go after this. On July 10th, they had engaged a tremendous amount of community leaders across the country to come up with a plan, and that is one of the lessons of this, is you've got to involve the community early and often in these kinds of plans. And he was starting to get progress reports by July 22nd. And having worked with Francis, those were probably some tough meetings. The result was a program called the Community Engagement Alliance Against COVID-19 Disparities, or SEAL. And this was set up really by the fall. We started seeing this, and Active worked closely with it. So the SEAL initiative really had several key focuses. The first was to, of course, to establish partnerships. But really, one of the main goals was to combat misinformation in these communities. And the second major goal was then to involve more people from these minority communities in the research, so they would not be as suspicious of these of these treatments, and be able to accelerate the uptake of these treatments in these communities. You can see the communities of focus here. The methods that were used to really do this was to put together teams that would actually go out into the communities and work with community leaders. There were 10 initial teams, and in 2021 we added another 11 for 21. When I say we, this was NIH. And these folks went out And these were not just scientists, which you see here on the top, researchers, but this involved church-based organizations, local academic health centers, community leaders, community political leaders, local pharmacy networks, and community-based organizations. And this is another critical message here, is that we realize scientists really, you can't just lead this with scientists. You need to get out and you need to engage with the entire community. Their tactics were a combination of not just setting up the partnerships and having conversations, but creating a website and social media campaign that would get the message out. By the end of the pandemic, these campaigns had resulted in over 2 billion views. So this was quite far-reaching through their website and social media. But also critical were events at local. You have to actually get out in the community. You can't just do things over your iPhone. And so they would hold youth engagement events. Where they would, try to make sure that message got out. You can see there was, they would crowdsource the message idea. So again, asking the community what they think will be effective, not going off in a closet and deciding, well, here's what the message is going to be. They hosted town halls with community health leaders and local organizations and professionals to get the word out. And had vaccination Saturdays at several of the HBCUs to try and boost vaccination. Within ACTIV itself, we felt while we worked closely with SEAL that was not going to be enough. And for our outpatient trial, ACTIV-2, we really wanted to make sure that this had a very diverse audience. So we work with NIH and several professional media firms to put together a campaign in the specific targeted areas where we wanted to get recruitment to these trials. And the ACTIV-2 campaign was called Rise Above COVID. You can see an example of it here. And this went out also in a lot of media and was really helpful in boosting enrollment from a minority and underserved communities in the trials. Finally, the HHS had its own communications campaign called Combat COVID. As you can see here, achieved a lot of different touch points. I do need to say that this was a lot less useful because it did not get started until pretty late in 2021. It was one of those things that just took too long to occur. But it did help us toward the end of the pandemic when we were dealing with, starting to deal more with variants. So how did we do? One of the other themes of my talk is how difficult, one of our problems is that we are data poor when it comes to measuring equity in healthcare. We do not gather enough data. Only 43% of clinical trials report race and ethnicity data. And so it's really hard to figure out how well you're doing when you don't know what your baseline is. And I don't know if this is the best source for this kind of information, but you figure FDA does see all of the drug trials. And this is, they've been putting out a snapshots report. This is the latest one they have. I can tell you the ones for 2015 to 2019 show much worse participation from racial and ethnic minorities than the 2020 did. And of course, this was a pandemic year. So this is sort of the baseline that I thought that we should compare it to. And if you see, we did pretty well, ACTIV did in its therapeutics trials, compared to the norm. And you also have to consider the fact, first of all, that the FDA information is coming. Only 54% of those trials were in the US. So there, you do get some diversity by working in Africa and South America and so forth. and 92% of our population, this was a U.S. government-focused effort, so it's not surprising that that's, although we did recruit outside the U.S., it was difficult to do that rapidly. But as you can see, we went from about 8% in black populations to about 14%, and in Hispanic, the term they use, populations, 11% for most trials and 31% in the active trials. So we do think that these actions did have some, real promise. There was also, I think, a pretty good success story in the COVID-19 vaccines portfolio. So the SEAL and other programs that I mentioned were not just used in the therapeutics. They were used by the CoVPN network at NIH that ran most of the vaccine trials that the US government sponsored. And you can see there were 6 of the vaccines here that were funded by and managed under that program. They were able to achieve about 47% participation by individuals identified as Black, Indigenous, or people of color. And that was surprisingly good. I'll tell you a story not often told is one of the reasons this occurred is because Francis Collins and Tony Fauci got on the phone every Saturday for the entire summer and into the fall of 2020, berating these companies and trying to get their participation in diverse communities higher. And they have several of these calls every Saturday. So this was really an effort from the top as well. So lessons learned. I mentioned the data issue. We do not have the data systems to fully understand and address the hidden disparities that exist out there. Frankly, an ongoing problem we have is that the clinical trial ecosystem in the United States is fragmented. Really, at the end of the day, government only pays for about 14% of the trials. 61% are paid for by biopharmaceutical industry. And it is by nature a highly competitive, fragmented, and transactional business. You have multiple trials going on in the same small hospital where they're trying to treat patients, and you have the same person responsible for these different trials, and it is hard sometimes to administer these programs in that environment. And this causes lack of standards, and the incentives, of course, the financial incentives to do this are not well aligned either. One of the other issues, and this is a drum that Janet Woodcock has been beating for maybe 10 or 15 years, is that we need to better integrate community care settings into our clinical trial ecosystem. Yes, we had to, in active, base a lot of our sites on the NIH-funded trial networks. But where are those trial networks focused? On large tertiary care, academic medical centers, often in large cities. And you knew you had a problem when you heard from one of your PIs trying to run one of these active trials and trying to reach patients because there was a surge in North Dakota that the community center they called up said, sure, we'd love to have the patients. We only have 90 days worth of cash left and we could use the money. So we have not found a way to invest in the community care settings and finding ways to do trials there and equipping them in order to do this. And that we learned during the COVID pandemic is where the patients are. I mentioned collaboration and co-creation with community partners from the get-go, involving them early and often. In a word, nothing about us without us ought to be the mantra. Leadership has to go beyond scientists. You've got to reach out to all the members of the community, and I think this institution has done a marvelous job of that. I was speaking to Ventura and Larry before the session. And you know, this issue where a practice we have of developing clinical trial materials in in English and then not even translating them into Spanish or other languages until months and months later is clearly not the way to go. All right, just a bit about the global effort. I mentioned the success we had in developing these vaccines. And that's sort of what FNIH mostly and NIH were mostly involved in and active. But the story about how they were distributed is clearly another story, as this graph shows. By the time that the WHO's alliance to attempt to distribute vaccines more equitably across the globe, which was called COVAX, started getting their act together and had their contracts in place, most of the available supply had been snapped up, by the leading, industrialized nations. And you can see here some of the distribution results. And then, of course, there were situations like where South Africa had the first surge in the Omicron, what turned out to be Omicron variants, and came forward and was extremely forthcoming with their information. They were on a lot of our calls, and were sort of, punished for this behavior. As the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation said, Southern Africa, last in line for vaccines, first in line for travel bans. So clearly we have to do a better job of doing this. And there's a great scientific reason for doing it, because pandemics don't just happen in one geography. They are global by nature. I think people realize this, and there has been an urgent call for some type of an international treaty between countries which would ensure that we do not go through this type of situation in the next pandemic. The Foundation for the NIH partnered with the O'Neill Institute for Global Health Law at Georgetown University. We were approached by WHO to do this. We don't normally work deeply with them, but because of our experience working with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, they felt we could convene the meetings to begin talking about this treaty. So we brought together heads of government agencies from 25 different countries. There has been several meetings, one or two in Washington and one most recently in Geneva, and the idea is to have a pandemic treaty in place by the end of next year, and countries will be asked to sign it. The treaty really aims for a world where we are able to more effectively control these, but also where the resources needed to control a pandemic are more equitably distributed across these populations. It is a difficult conversation. I was not at the meetings, but our lead corporate counsel, Kevin Klock, who led the effort, gave us a pretty good idea of what went on. But I think it is going to be successful, and the kinds of recommendations that you see here include addressing supply chain and logistics issues, the delicate issue of how you improve manufacturing capacity in these LMIC nations without sacrificing quality or safety of the vaccines. Harmonizing regulatory bodies, the EMA, the FDA, every country regulates medicines differently, and clearly in a pandemic that is a liability. Increasing, of course, R&D related to these new medical products, and establishing a system that will allow us better access to data. This was a real struggle, even getting information globally on variants and what was going on in places. We had an effort called TRACE, which I think was the closest thing to successful there. But it was hard to get all the global data together. So hopefully this will move forward. I can imagine that there's a little cynicism about this, because you don't have to sign a treaty. I don't know whether the U.S. will actually sign this treaty, but one thing that we do know from past treaties is they get paid attention to, and that even if a country doesn't formally sign something, they start to implement some of the suggestions that are in that treaty. And hopefully this will be successful, because we're going to need it, because sometime, whether it's the next 8 years, the next 20 years, or the next 150 years, there will be another pandemic. Conclusions. I mentioned that these inequities were in the system all along, but they were starkly highlighted by the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. I think the efforts that were done through ACTIV can show not only that we can have rapid, efficient development of treatments or testing of treatments, but we can, with a concerted effort, improve inclusivity in the biomedical economic research system. I can tell you there are hundreds of efforts going on to increase diversity in healthcare. I'm positioned that I hear about them. Every pharmaceutical company has now a chief diversity officer that is looking at how their trials can become more diverse. I know this because our current leader, Julie Gerberding, who was also former head of the CDC, came to us from Merck, and that was her job. PhRMA, the trade organization, is working on a plan to bring together the resources of all of their pharmaceutical company members to create pilots, 10 or so of these pilots at academic institutions across the country, to really try out different approaches to this and see what works. Every government or agency now has rules in place to try and ensure this and so forth. My worry is that these things are fragmented and that nobody is really talking to each other. And that results in a lack of coordination and wasted resources. So that's the bad news on that one. And I think that finally, trust is only built through sustained effort. It has to be consistent. It has to be sustained. You can't come one week and say, we really want to work with you, and then go away. And, given what's going on politically, you've got to worry a little bit about whether all of the efforts associated with addressing the pandemic are going to be sustained or whether we're going to go back to business as usual. I think doing that would be fatal. Thank you. There are folks with the mics. So questions and, of course, comments about what you heard.
Sure. I'll have Dr. Schlesinger, and then I have one on our chat.
Sure.
David, thank you very much, and it's great to have this perspective, that knowing more about the foundation and the work you've done with the NIH proper, absolutely essential, and the resources available allow for a lot to happen. President Biden has a very aggressive agenda here announced in terms of a much more rapid response in the future. You've talked about some of the initiatives now that are in place to help us going forward. And I asked a similar question yesterday about what's different. And you commented in your third bullet there on the fragmented nature. So, 11 months was incredible speed to a vaccine. But what you described today was a lot of what I call reaction energy, which has itself a huge slowdown. So, what are some of your ideas, out-of-the-box ideas, that might help us actually transform what is the inevitability of the next pandemic and other global crises?
Yeah, so I actually was of the opinion, living through this and seeing the efforts were going on sort of at the highest levels and attempting to address this, that by the end of 2020, there should have been a blue ribbon panel at the highest level of government to talk about what we had done wrong in the first 8 months and what we could do better. All of the missteps with diagnostics, with supply chain issues and so forth. And then probably another post-mortem around now. And there have been some of these conversations ongoing, but I think it's difficult to get the message across in this political environment. I do know that my boss talks to a lot of folks in the Congress, and when you get them alone one by one, they get it. They understand that this is going to be a problem. But I think it's going to take some dialogue, and I think, unfortunately, it's also going to take some funds. My concern is when you see things like the APP program at NIAID. So this is designed to do the preclinical development right up to clinical testing of drugs that could be useful against 8 major families of pandemic threats. So coronavirus is just one of them, right? And you've got Ebola, you've got filoviruses, you've got all these other pathogens. And it was originally supposed to have a $2.3 billion budget. It got cut to 1.5, and I'm not sure where it is now. And other efforts don't seem to have a lot of momentum behind them. So, I think out of the box might be that, rather than waiting for government to be the solution, the scientific community needs to band together to do this. And a similar issue, Larry, which is really intimately intertwined in this, is the crisis we have in trust in science, which is only going to be solved if the scientific community gets together with the business community and speaks out with one voice to counter some of the absolute nonsense that's been going on out there.
I was going to say, you two sound a lot alike in those types of talking points, so I can really appreciate that.
We're both from New Jersey,
okay,
so that's why.
Okay, we've got it. I was going to read the question from Dr. Ricardo Carrion. His first question that he sent online was regarding the 95% failure rate of clinical trials that was cited. What is the main obstacle to more success? Is it lack of preclinical testing, or are preclinical models not adequately characterized?
It's probably a lot of things. One of the things, I mentioned this Accelerating Medicines partnership earlier. So this is about 10 years old. And it really got started because Francis Collins met with all the heads of R&D and asked exactly that question, because productivity of the biopharmaceutical development pipeline was even worse 10 years ago than it is now. It's improved somewhat in terms of approved drugs. And the answer they came up with is that we do not have an adequate understanding of the drug targets that we're going after. So, I compare it to like playing, darts blindfolded in the back of the pub. You're trying to, every once in a while you hear this sort of satisfying thud. You get a hit, but you're not quite sure why and what part of the dartboard you hit and so forth. And so being able to deconstruct these diseases and understand more about how they work, and then having ways of not just generating new targets, but the data to figure out whether they work, I think is one approach. And that's what AMP is doing. It's been doing it in Alzheimer's disease, type 2 diabetes, Parkinson's disease, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, and schizophrenia. And it's all taking all different approaches depending on what the needs are. So I think that's one thing. Certainly preclinical development is another issue, but and to be fair, preclinical models don't work for all diseases. For the ones they do work, it's great, but animal models don't always translate to human. I'm hopeful that the revolution that's occurring in data science and bioengineering is going to help address a lot of this. We had our board meeting yesterday, and Larry Tabak, the acting director of NIH, came to talk to us, and he said that's one encouraging trend. He says every NIH institute now is about bioengineering. And so I think some of those things will help us develop, reduce the failure rate, and also produce medicines that are more effectively and precisely targeted.
Go to Dr. Wiesenthal, and I think Akuto has a question.
Thank you, sir, for a great talk. I'm Allison Wiesenthal, I'm a palliative care doctor. My question was back to your slide showing all the integration of, community health resources, schools, religious places. What infrastructure exists in perpetuity based on that relationship that was created during that pandemic timeframe that will persist and might, speed up those issues, like prevent those issues from happening at the next pandemic?
So I can only tell you from the NIH perspective that a SEAL effort will continue. There's a whole office co-led by Gary Gibbons, who's the head of NHLBI, and Eliseo Perez-Stable, another institute and center director at NIH. And this is just this ongoing theme. It's a huge theme internally within NIH, but also to ensure that this goes on externally in research. It's something that we're engaged in internally and externally at FNIH. And some of it is part of this whole patient-centered movement. But I think that a lot of these structures are, like I said, everybody's now aware of this. Everybody's doing something. Whether they're all talking to each other is another question. But that's actually an encouraging situation, I think.
Thank you for such a great presentation, Dr. Wally. At Texas Biomed, we're really committed to working with research institutes across the world, particularly in developing countries. And in the context of the pandemic treaty, global pandemic treaty that you've spoken of, what is the NIH's vision for building capacity, research capacity in developing countries in partnership with research institutes like ours that have been doing this for decades and doing it well? Yeah. We're really keen to play a role in that space, so love to hear what you all are planning.
So I'm not the NIH, right? FNIH, and I can't speak for the NIH. And I do know that there is the Fogarty Institute and Center has worked with our Global Health Group and the Gates Foundation to do some of that. I know also anecdotally it's a huge passion of Francis Collins to do that. But outside of that, I don't know, of formal programs. Remember, the funding for NIH is domestic from the Congress. And while they do, I think, have a strong global presence in terms of solving the puzzle of diseases, their sort of main responsibility is not building healthcare infrastructure in these communities. So I'm not sure to what degree they do that, quite honestly. As for working with Texas Biomedical Health Institute, I'm sure there's interest in that. We already have a tremendous amount of involvement with the NIH.
Hello. My question is, of course, one of the largest disparities that were noticed during this pandemic was in education in K through 12. And a lot of it had to do with the bureaucracy of, say, TEA and its disconnect with the science community. So how can the science community better inform or get more involved in what would be K through 12 to really reach out to the community? Because I saw your graph, you had, all the different locations, but a teacher alone can influence over 5,000 students in the matter of, 20 years. So that's my question for you. Just, of course, how can the science community connect to what would be public education?
Yeah, I'm not at all expert in K through 12 education. Maybe you can make some suggestions along those lines. I will say that I do think it's tied up with this trust in science issue, because one of the next threat, it will not only be, the next threat we're going to have is the threat against STEM education, right? And we're already seeing some erosion of interest in STEM education because, people are told, well, the science is just a bunch of hooey anyway. So it is a big issue. I think that is, we have a number of programs that we work on, that we are trying to work on with the NIH to ensure greater health equity in the biomedical research arena and in the workforce in young scientists. So one is training minority serving institutions in how to interpret the data that's coming out of this huge All of Us study that NIH has been This is this global study of healthcare across a large population, swath of the population of the United States. Another is addressing educational knowledge of genomics. We're doing this with the National Human Genome Research Institute. And making sure that in minority and underserved communities there's a better understanding of the whole genetic side of research, because that is lacking. But frankly, these are addressing, they're addressing the biomedical, the postdocs and so forth, and the students, the medical students. It's probably really not aimed at the K through 12, but I do agree that unless we, that is where you really want to start getting people interested, or you won't have the ones that are in the programs that we're addressing.
All right, we have 2 minutes, so if somebody can make it super short, one of the students up at the front table. I'd love to let a student ask a question.
Yes. Hello, my name is Ava Schreier, and I'm a junior at Roosevelt High School. So I have a question. I wanted to ask, how do you think we can improve adequate agreement strategies for ensuring global health equity, and how can the youth play a role in facilitating this?
Wow, that's a great question.
Thank you.
I love that question. I think the pandemic treaty we're working on is only one thing. That's something the Gates Foundation and others there's a lot of different organizations that are involved in that. And maybe what they ought to be doing is focusing a bit more on, and I don't know to the extent they have these youth programs, but that would be a great idea. And I'm going to take that back to our Gates team and see what is being done about that and can be done about it. So if I get your contact information, that'd be wonderful. That's a great idea.
I think this is y'all's second year here, is that correct? And last year you left with a lot of business cards also, because they're all about youth voice.
So you're good at this.
Yeah. Great. All right, I think that's about all we have.
Thank you so much for listening.
Very much.
Really appreciate it.